So today they give the Nobel Peace Prize. Do you think it's going to be for me? Hey, good morning. This is Piero and Giorgio. Today I'm in Oslo. I gave a conference here and I would like to talk to you about Norway and the economic collapse. Spécial dédicace à Oleg.
How is Norway going to cope to an economic collapse? So for those who haven't read my books or haven't seen some of my earlier presentations, I am analyzing the world's economy's future collapse in my books and in my reasoning based on a convergence of massive problems that are global in reach, and global in its causes. We're talking about overpopulation, we're talking about economic and financial collapse, we're talking about the disruption of the globalized economies, we are talking about collapses of ecosystems, scarcity of resources, and all of this is leading through processes that I describe in my books to, I think, far-reaching and long-term economic collapses and certainly economic contractions that are going to hit every country in the world, and of course with differences. So I would like to tell you a little bit what I think about Norway. So first of all, of course, I'm not Norwegian, and I've just been in and out of Norway a few times and only in Oslo for work and as a tourist. So obviously I am not an expert on this. But as you've seen in many of my country reports here on my YouTube channel, I do in fact investigate a little bit when I don't know, and I certainly ask locals and experts what they think. And perhaps I have the skill of good intuition by listening and connecting the dots of what I can see and what I can read in my travels. So what I can say about Norway is if I apply my a SWOT analysis, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, I would say that if the economy of the world shuts down, collapses, or even if it severely slows down, Norway definitely has some strength. First of all, like Switzerland, it's a rich country. It has a fairly low population number, but contrary to Switzerland, it also has very, very low population density. So this is really good. Norway has some excellent natural resources. First of all, water, and I do mean water that you can drink. So clearly, with all the mountains, the lakes, and the rainfall that you have, water resources are going to be very, very precious, of course, very deep and very wide. So this is very, very good for you. You also have, while we speak of water, you also have a lot of fish resources, provided you can maintain a fleet of fishermen with enough fuel and maintenance to go and keep fishing. So that will be an incredibly big asset. Obviously, I mentioned oil, so oil and gas are clearly assets, while the petroleum and gas fields of Norway have decreased in output in the recent decades. Of course, they're still significant and above what Norway consumes. Therefore, Norway will be able to get some fuel and manage. Perhaps it will be difficult, but certainly manage in terms of energy. If you add to this the hydroelectric output from the different sources in the fjords, in the mountains, and the big rivers, with dams that create that enable to provide hydroelectricity, and provided you can maintain these long term through local production of spare parts and different elements, you can keep providing electricity if you're well organized. So these are big strengths and big opportunities, in fact. Most wealth and most strength of nations are its people. And I must say that here, Norwegians are still very, very strong, I think, strong minded. They are still traditional in many ways. I was surprised to see how pagan traditions, and that means really old traditions, have been kept alive for, I think, a significant proportion of Norwegian people. Not all, by far, of course, but and certainly not a majority. But these traditions are there, and I was surprised when I traveled recently, just now in Oslo. I was there on December 7th, 8th, and 9th, 2018, to see how much people still love, at least the people in and around Oslo, to go to the Christmas markets, to go to visit museums of the folk houses, and therefore they celebrate by visiting and by remembering and by keeping alive many of the traditions. We had a very great Christmas dinner with some friends who invited me for a conference, and that Christmas dinner was awesome, was really good, and it showed that there is really a tradition that is kept alive. I mentioned that Norway is a rich country, and so being rich means that you may have assets, and provided the Norwegian kroner is not linked to the dollar so much, and even if the world economy collapses, it could be that for a while this currency is still valued. It is still linked to some real assets that provide a base value to it, and of course, that could be an element of stability in case of problems and chaos. A big asset, of course, and a strength is its relative isolation. Being in the north with a rough sea on the side where you don't have migrants sailing in from it easily, you have a fairly cold weather most of the years. Therefore, it is not a place where people will come easily. And because you still have a lot of little towns and villages up in the mountains, away from the main trade routes and let's say war zones of potential chaos in the world. Now, of course, the weaknesses of Norway are the reverse of and always linked with the strength. I mentioned Norway being rich and Norwegian being rich. Well, that can also be a weakness, because usually wealthy nations and rich people in general are not as hardworking, or certainly get used to comfort more than perhaps people who have less means, or in nations that are poorer. So obviously, having had so much wealth from oil in the last 40 years has made Norwegians, I wouldn't say lazy, that's not the word, but certainly um, used to have a lot of comfort, and used to have a state that provides a lot of services, a lot of goods, low taxes often, and certainly free or almost free education, healthcare, and good pensions and things like that. So all these nice things that the government provides, and the government is pretty large and pretty expensive and pretty costly in Norway, because obviously you had the money to fund it. Well, if this disappears, or if there is less funding, what are the government employees going to do if there is no more funding for that? What are people who depend on government funding going to do if that funding stops? Whilst probably the case of Norway in an economic collapse is going to be less severe and less harsh than other countries, you will still have a lot of people who used to be government employees that suddenly will have to work for a life, and provide enough of that work to be able to feed themselves. And this is not necessarily easy in a different world where the economy is not as good. And this is the same kind of problems that Switzerland has. Another one problem similar to Switzerland that Norway has, and which is also linked to being rich, is that you have a lot of people who are way too generous with foreign aid, too generous with accepting anyone in the country. While of course Norway is not as bad as Sweden, or as in the UK or France or Germany, it still is attracting a lot and way too much refugees and people from all over the world who may not necessarily, first of all, integrate very well, but also, in case of economic problems, um, be in solidarity with the Norwegian people because they are belonging to a different tribe. I'm not saying this is 100% guaranteed, but there is a strong chance and a strong trend to that. Also, of course, a weakness of Norway, which is also geographical, is that because it's isolated and because it's so north, because of the cold, long winters, it means that people will need absolutely to be ready to go back to food production techniques that allow for producing a lot of food in a very short period of time and then storing and managing this food throughout the cold and difficult seasons. And this is not necessarily something that has been kept alive because obviously today, like in every country, especially modern rich countries, you can import food and you can have any kind of food all year round, whatever is the season, whatever is the need. So this is clearly a weakness that needs to be managed. So obviously, government of Sweden should be induced, should be lobbied to take care to have contingency plan in the scenario, in the hypothesis where suddenly the world economies don't work anymore. Some of the opportunities of Norway is that with its oil and gas, it will probably still be able to trade it with foreign countries. It can probably trade and negotiate some help across the seas, and certainly could help Sweden, certainly could help Finland, certainly could have deals with maybe the UK if the pipelines still work, and perhaps with continental Europe, if I may say so, like of course Denmark or parts of Germany that would still be able to exchange some resources against oil and gas. Likewise, the opportunities of great fishing assets means that if the oceans are not too polluted and if not overfished during economic crisis, that extra fish that can be exported could be brought to the major harbors of Northern Europe to feed populations there against, of course, currency like gold and silver or other raw materials that are needed to manufacture, these turbines to keep the dams and hydroelectric plants working. So there could be some interesting sources of commerce across the North Sea and the Baltic. Perhaps a new Hanseatic League will be able to be formed in the next decades. The opportunities are linked with autonomy. If the food production can be enough, if the trade can be kept at the minimum, and if manufacturing can enable you to keep working, to keep the machines running, there's a good chance that the quality of life will not collapse completely, that you can still keep a fairly decent and reasonable success in maintaining the population numbers, to maintain the public health, to maintain epidemics away, and of course to keep off potential refugees from Europe. So I think another opportunity is that, which could be an asset or could be a weakness, obviously, is the fact that you are a kingdom and not necessarily a democracy. Of course, today you are a democracy. Norway is a democracy, but has a king and has a royalty. And if that royalty stops being just a figurehead and starts to act because it can act, or it could act, or because it has convictions and because it has character, well, the king can lead. The king can lead its people, can lead and take the good decisions. So in fact, King of Norway should read my books and should learn from them and push some policies. In fact, I think politicians from Norway, if they read me, can learn a lot like other politicians in other countries did. The threats to Norway, besides of course, by definition, the economic collapse is a threat to the lifestyle, to the wealth, and to the stability of the country. Well, the threats are first of all linked to oil. What if foreign powers or even local powers in need of oil target Norway for invasion to take the oil? And I'm not talking about Russia. Russia has a lot of oil. I'm not even talking about the United States, which is always invading countries who have oil. But how about the European Union or different other NATO partners who absolutely will need Norwegian oil to keep, for example, the UK or France or Germany alive. So you have to be careful. So keeping armed forces high quality and alert is going to be very important, and not necessarily to prevent a Russian invasion in the north, like during the Cold War, but certainly to think about how you protect your oil and gas assets, but also your hydroelectric um, dams and power plants, which are a very important strategic asset for you. So be careful. You're a big country with small population. That means it's fairly easy to invade. So keep perhaps the traditions of the local militias, traditions of having good quality armed forces to defend the country alive, especially in the first years of economic collapse. Now, the threat is obviously that because you are rich and because you will survive better than other countries, you will be facing flows of immigration, not necessarily from the third world as it is now, but could be by nations who have collapsed completely, such as Germany, certainly France, certainly the UK, and certainly parts of the Benelux. And some people will say, well, hey, Norway has place. Norway has still functioning economy and functioning health and electricity and therefore they may want to come en masse. And you certainly cannot, like Switzerland, will never be able to accept millions of refugees from France, from Germany, from other countries. So clearly, that is a big, big threat because the falling down of economies across the world will have a domino effect from one another and eventually will reach every country in the world. And therefore, if you're not if you don't have the willpower and the strength to shut down the borders, to say no to most of these refugees, of these immigrants, and perhaps have some exceptions for the people who have skills that are absolutely key for you, or perhaps you want to consider to accept some of the European refugees to help them build back the forces to go back and conquer and liberate the countries they come from. That is possible. But certainly I would advise Norway to have a very, very strict, even today, even when the economy is good, but definitely when it collapses, to have a very, very strict immigration policy and actually to make sure that there is no massive invasion of poor people from across the sea, and not even faraway seas, just the channel of the Danish channel and perhaps even Sweden. So be careful with that. So it's not often that I am very positive, but I think Norway has some strong potential. Of course, a lot of people tell me that Norway is not that or as great as it looks from analyzing financial or oil production or agricultural data. And even if the Scandinavian governments are usually with reputation of being, of course, too big, too slow, but at the same time sort of honest and efficient, I've been warned that in fact there's quite a lot of corruption in Norway too. I cannot judge if this is true or not, but I've been told that by several people. And certainly one element of Norway is that it's being part of NATO could lead Norway into military adventures that are not in its interest. It could be that, for example, a collapsing United States pushes for war against Russia and therefore makes Norway go to war against its interest, and a war that could turn nuclear would see some of the key installations in Norway targeted by nuclear strikes, of course, in retaliation from Russia. So you could very well imagine that some of your major military bases, some of your big harbors would be nuked in that kind of war, without even talking about chemical or biological deployments. So that obviously would be a disaster. So being part of NATO today is actually more a danger than an opportunity. It's actually more a risk than an asset. So I believe, like what I'm saying to most NATO countries, is to get away from NATO. This is a very dangerous alliance today. It's time to do different ones and for different means. NATO is an offensive alliance against Russia and China today. Perhaps it's time to have defensive alliances with countries against some of the invasions that Europe is suffering today and is having to face. So different alliances, different approaches, but certainly different mindsets. And I must say that all the Norwegian people I've met, they're very kind, perhaps too kind, like the Swedes, like Danish people, but they're still tough. I can feel that there is a toughness. There is some good, solid, sound, genetic material from fishermen, from mountain people, and from what used to be a long time ago the Vikings. People who are adventurous, people who are willing to take risks. You know, only 100 years ago, you had people like Amundsen going to the North Pole, to the South Pole, and this exploring and sailor and mountaineer philosophy and way of living isn't definitely a big asset. So I am fairly confident that Norwegians and Norway will fare much better than most countries during a major economic collapse. However, this doesn't mean that you can't be prepared and that you should really think about more communities in the agriculture, in the fishing, people developing more manual skills to be able to keep working in the lands, in the sea, crafting tools with their hands and with little machines and little tool shafts. And therefore, this is an opportunity. So I can only encourage my friends in Norway to think about what would mean a major collapse of the world economy and how it would impact their own lives in Norway. I think they can get to fairly good conclusions that they need a network of people, of friends, of families that can help. They need probably to have resources in the countryside or at sea if they are from families who fish, and definitely be multifunctional in those skills that they can develop and those relationships across them. All of this is explained in my book, Survive the Economic Collapse, and I can only encourage you to read it. And for sure, I look forward to my next future visits in Norway, because it is a country that I really enjoyed. Thank you very much, and remember that you can subscribe, and of course I'll put the links to my books. Take care. Ciao.
Nå har de gått av gårde for toddy i forkant, ikke sant? For nå er det en for toddy, og så har de gått av gårde. Nå er vi på toddy. Jeg vet det, ikke
So, what do we have here? Ta-da-da! Fearless girl in celebration of women, Christmas, Kristen Visberg. I wonder if they're going to expose this in Saudi Arabia. So Vargi, did you burn this one? No, bad pagan.